Now, whatever you think about the military onslaught being waged against the people of Gaza by the Israeli state, there's no question that it would not be possible without the support of the United States of America, the last global superpower, of course, and the key protector, defender, armor of Israel. Without the arms, diplomatic support, political support, aid that the US offers, none of this would be possible. That's a straightforward fact. You don't have to agree or disagree with me about Gaza. That's a fact. So it's really important, actually, that I speak to a brilliant guest, Waleed Shahid, who is a progressive strategist, the former spokesperson of the Justice Democrats, who played such a fundamental role in helping to build the new generation of progressive Democrats. We can see them, of course, with the squad in the Congress, but also politicians across the United States. I think that gives us a lot of hope for the future of progressive politics in the US. And Wally's played a pivotal role in all of that. So a key person to speak to. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Owen.
Okay, let's just start, shall we, in terms of Joe Biden? Because I'll just start with a big question. Is he buggered? Has he destroyed his presidency? I mean, he was someone who probably could have got away with, by the standards of most US presidents, probably could have got away with looking relatively inoffensive. Particularly given, I suppose, the expectations maybe a lot of people on the left had about him. You know, things like withdrew from Afghanistan, didn't launch any major war that slaughtered huge numbers of people. So he didn't have the kind of LBJ problem of doing some kind of relatively progressive legislation at home, but then just destroying Southeast Asia. That came to a pretty abrupt end, that particular hope, with his support of Israel's onslaught against Gaza. So basically, has he nuked any chance of winning the presidential election? Does that mean Donald Trump's going to become president?
I think right now all signs point to Donald Trump winning the general election, but American elections can change very quickly. And so who knows what happens when we get to October. A majority of American voters right now say they don't believe Joe Biden or Donald Trump will be on the ticket when it comes to the actual election. So that's a significant number, but you're right that there was actually a lot of goodwill, a fair amount of goodwill between President Biden and younger voters, progressive voters, and working class voters because of things like the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, some student debt pauses, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most significant climate investment in U.S. history and global history. And through that, he was able to represent the majority of the Democratic base and majority of the kinds of voters who are most skeptical of him. And then the war in Gaza started, and the U.S., in many significant ways, Biden has broken partially or fully from the failed conventional wisdom of the Clinton-Obama wings of the Democratic Party. But on Israel, he's frankly doubled down on a set of failed policies, and when there's no good faith negotiating partner on the other side, meaning Benjamin Netanyahu has in his own self-interest a Donald Trump the re-election of Donald Trump, so he can get away with even more gross violations. So currently, it does look like Donald Trump will win the general election. And I remember even many people in your country, Owen, were very much jealous that we had Joe Biden and not Keir Starmer. And I remember that people were much more happy with Joe Biden than the Labor Party leader. And so
we're desperate.
Yeah, but things have changed a lot in the last 3 months, and he's bled a lot of support from young people, and then the key constituency. It's this weird fact of American geography with our electoral college that the largest community of Arab Americans happens to be in Michigan, which is a swing state that's very difficult for a Democratic president to win without that state.
Yeah, I mean, obviously people are very angry, those who obviously passionately oppose what's happened to Gaza with Keir Starmer. But of course, Joe Biden is the president of the world's remaining superpower, and now is called often Genocide Joe, I suppose. So I take your point. I mean, just in terms of, because we often, in the US and British context, but in the US, we talk about the most progressive generation ever. The polling amongst younger voters for Joe Biden is bad, isn't it? It's terrible.
Yeah, it's I think something like in Michigan, it seemed like there's some poll that showed that younger voters, so voters under the age of 30, equally split between Biden and a potential third-party candidate, meaning either Robert Kennedy or Cornel West. Those are abysmal numbers for a Democratic candidate who's the president going for re-election. I mean, there's been a generational divide in the Democratic Party for a long time over issues from healthcare to climate to reproductive rights, and now we're seeing it spill over to questions of war and foreign policy. This is a generation, as you know, that grew up with wars on terrors in Afghanistan and Iraq that failed. And I think this generation is just skeptical of what the administration says, that terrorism can only be rooted out through more war and more terror and more bombs. They've seen that fail twice already in our lifetime, and I think think that there's probably a diplomatic and political solution to the question of Hamas, the question of Palestinian human rights, and do not support U.S. funding for this war. Again, it was already going to be difficult given the president's age, given the skyrocketing cost of living in the U.S. Like for many, that affects young people a lot, who, especially those who haven't attended college, those in the service sector, grocery bills, rent, healthcare, and then on top of that, you see that the president is funding a war overseas. I think it all is a recipe for disaster when it comes to the general election.
Yeah, I mean, just talking about kind of, I guess, Michigan's coming up. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that means and what that represents, signifies? Because Michigan traditionally is a kind of bellwether state, isn't it? And its demographics have changed. You've had traditionally blue-collar white Americans who live there. There's a growing Muslim population in Michigan. Seen quite a lot of racist portrayals, I have to say, of its voters in U.S. newspapers. So what's the kind of situation there?
Yeah, Michigan is part of what we call the Blue Wall. It's largely one of the largest union states in the country. The United Auto Workers, most of their members are in Michigan. If you think of things like GM and Chrysler and Ford, and those factories are largely based in, what's left of them are largely based in Michigan, and used to be a completely Democratic state until 2016, when Trump famously beat Hillary Clinton with 10,000 votes and a majority of union households. And so Michigan is also where many Lebanese and Palestinian Americans migrated to due to war and occupation in their home countries. And there's this kind of, I don't know if you would call it poetic justice or poetic injustice, that these same new Americans, that these migrants who've become citizens, become voters, become members of the Democratic Party, may decide the fate of President Biden and may decide the fate of American democracy come November. Next week, on February 27th, is the Democratic primary in Michigan, in which, there's a centrist candidate, Dean Phillips, running, who has no chance. Marianne Williamson dropped out. Michigan is one of a handful of states that has a none of the above option. It's called uncommitted. So the primary will have Dean Phillips, Joe Biden, and then an option that says uncommitted. There's a major effort underway in Michigan, led by the Arab American community there, to get voters to vote uncommitted, to show that the anti-war constituency in the Democratic Party could hold the margin of victory for President Biden come November. And so 10,000 votes is all they need to show that this is a constituency that's uncommitted to Joe Biden unless he stops funding the war in Gaza. And it's been supported by elected officials like Rashida Tlaib, the mayor of Dearborn, Abdullah Hammoud, who has a New York Times op-ed out today about some of this stuff. The majority leader in the Michigan State House, Abraham Ayush, and so it's like a pretty significant effort. This is a generation that is very well organized politically and is like a core constituency of both the labor movement and the Democratic Party. And so they're taking this battle into the Democratic primary, and it's been controversial. Like if you turn on TV in the past couple days, you're just filled with talking heads and pundits being like, these stupid people from Michigan are gonna are damaging the president's reputation before November. They're gonna cause Donald Trump to win. I think it's a very substantive campaign using the levers of democracy to put pressure on the administration. But many people in this country just see things as red versus blue, Trump versus Biden, and we'll see what happens on February 27th.
Something which I thought was very striking, and it gave me quite a wry smile. I can't remember which US newspapers I read it in, but it had a kind of Democratic source talking about young disaffection or youth disaffection or relative millennial. I think that's generous calling it young because the oldest millennial is about 43 now. Millennials and Gen Z who are upset with Joe Biden. And they were like, well, they often consume their news in different ways, like TikTok. So they're not seeing all the ways that Joe Biden's really trying to influence Benjamin Netanyahu behind the scenes. And I kind of thought when I saw that, I was like, well, that's probably for the best, because anyone who believes that is being a bit of a sucker. If they're seeing on cable news, which does have an older age in terms of the average age who watches cable news or reading various newspapers, leaked reports about how Joe Biden's got really, really upset this time. He's really, really upset. Oh, it's so awful. Oh, Benjamin, can you really cut it out? Honestly, I'm really, really mean it this time. Please just tone it down a bit. It's just because obviously the US has lots of levers it can pull, like military support, and it could just pull the plug anytime it wanted. So I just think that's interesting because they have a view basically that younger people, because they're seeing basically children being blown apart on TikTok. That's having quite an impact on them. I think it's quite a damning indictment. Do you not think of like the US media ecosystem that basically what are clearly ineffective ways to change the situation are portrayed as, that young people would change their mind if only they saw what the Democrats were actually doing behind the scenes?
Well, so much of the U.S. media ecosystem, particularly cable TV, is entirely framed on, does X help or hurt Joe Biden? Does X help or hurt Donald Trump? And that's just not, I do think that a lot of younger people are getting their news from not cable TV, from either digital outlets or social media. And that's frankly just not how much of the coverage of Gaza is framed in digital outlets or social media. It's sometimes much more substantive about the issue itself, the humanitarian concerns that are happening, the skyrocketing death toll of women and children. Like much of the Gaza debate, much of the debate around the war is totally framed on MSNBC and CNN and other outlets as, what can the president do? It's Netanyahu. And in October, when the war started, Netanyahu was framed in a different light today because of the things they're trying to shed. The administration is trying to shed its previous kind of bear hug of him. They tried to convince us originally in October that the bear hug approach would get Netanyahu to be less vengeful. Now, this Listen to Michigan campaign launched 3 weeks ago. In the last 3 weeks, there's been so many leaks from the White House and from sources close to Biden that they had this leak. And when they went to Dearborn, the White House said that they apologized for some of the actions and rhetoric they had in October, and they should have taken a more forceful stance. They said that privately to a group of Arab Americans in Dearborn, but Biden hasn't said anything publicly even to that extent. And, like you said, like the main thing they could do is to stop funding a war they apparently disagree with. I think that many people in Dearborn, they keep saying, and Detroit, they keep saying that if the policy matters more than the rhetoric and the messaging. And so, it is improvement that they're trying to damage control their brand, I guess, but they could condition or restrict or end the military funding tomorrow if they wanted to.
If I was going to ask you a bit of a kind of not devil's advocate position, but just going into the weeds a bit, and it does need a heavy caveat because Joe Biden, his entire political career, has made it clear that he will unequivocally stand behind Israel no matter what it does. I mean, in the mid-1980s, he told Congress that if Israel didn't exist, the US would have to invent it to serve US interests. I mean, he didn't even put a kind of spin on it as a kind of, on the terms of Zionism traditionally. He just said, this will facilitate US interests. That was the argument he was making in his speech. But nonetheless, it's true, 50% now of supporters of Joe Biden think Israel's committing genocide. But there were other Democratic voters who actually support what Israel's doing. And that doesn't include then the Republican side of the equation. And you have AIPAC, for those who don't know, it's the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is an extremely powerful lobby which targets with huge amounts of money, either supports candidates who support what Israel is doing or go hard against candidates who don't. And there isn't a body with the equivalent strength on the other side. So these are real challenges, aren't they? These, we could say, well, actually, there's a growing constituency, which I'll ask you about, but actually, there's a massive challenge. So what's the argument there? What's the counter argument?
I think there are parts of your argument that are true, which is that, look, the Arab American community, the Muslim American community, and frankly, like millennial organizations are new in this country. Their political infrastructure isn't as well financed or well developed. I hear all the time that when it comes to calls into Congress, AIPAC is always beating progressives on like getting people in congressional districts to make phone calls to members of Congress. That has slowly started to change since this war started in October. Like there have been huge phone and like call-in days to members of Congress. Rashida Tlaib broke some fundraising records. It's still not to the level of the financial or political might of AIPAC, but it's developed. But frankly, like on the political side, I do think President Biden, there keeps being these op-eds like every day about what President Biden can do to win back voters. And it's always about he needs to do a TikTok, or he needs to do a Instagram. He needs to do more selfies on Instagram, and he needs to show people that he's not senile, blah, blah, blah. But a big thing he can do that isn't about his age is that he can try to unite the Democratic Party and align with the preferences of the majority of Democrats, which is, and supporting a ceasefire, ending funding for the war. I don't think a Democratic Party divided against itself can win a general election. He's pissed off a very large constituency of the volunteers that would knock doors or phone bank for him. This is he is the one who's fractured the party, and that's a much easier thing for him to resolve than questions around his age, which are kind of baked. But yeah, I do think that the political infrastructure needs to be developed, needs to be more enhanced. But this is frankly an ideological issue for Joe Biden, where he is much more deeply sympathetic to Israel as an idea, as a country, perhaps the idea of Israel from its founding, rather than the state of Israel today, which is increasingly a far-right ethno-nationalist state. It's also bizarre because you can find speeches and statements from President Biden about Ireland, about South Africa, that are very conditions that are somewhat similar to the conditions of Palestinians today, where he was much more sympathetic to South Africans or Catholics in Ireland, based on his own personal attachment and affiliations with some of those movements. Some of the things that President Biden was accused of being an IRA sympathizer his entire political career. And so I do think that it's kind of bizarre to see where he draws his, he has somewhat of a hierarchy of human value based on his personal attachment or his ideological views. So I am a little pessimistic about whether he would change his approach, but the only thing that could potentially change the approach is whether the electoral math of winning the general election, Michigan being a pivotal state.
I do think it's striking. It is worth just spelling out just how dramatic a shift has been in US public opinion, because the US traditionally overwhelmingly stood behind the Israeli state. Mm-hmm. And now the polling shows, look, if you'd said 20 or 30 years ago, the idea that half of Democratic voters would say that Israel is committing a genocide, no one would believe that would have been possible. And amongst younger people, you can see very, very hostile positions now towards the Israeli state, which was not the case for young people in the 1980s. So there has been
that's even more astonishing and surprising, given how when you turn on TV in the United States, every time there's a commercial break, you'll see commercials from the Israeli government talking about Hamas, talking about the hostages, and you have most Democratic Party elected officials supporting Israel wholeheartedly. Given those two things and the public information campaign, public affairs campaign against Palestinian human rights, the fact that those poll numbers are what they are is, to me, very surprising too.
So, I mean, does it look like? I mean, something's got to give, because it's clear which way. I mean, Israel's leaders are not clearly thinking very well about the long term, in that the US is their protector. it is their guarantor. I mean, it has been put to me as well, could just end with the rise of China, Israel might just go shopping for another guarantor, and maybe, who knows how things will shift. But as things stand, they are losing. That's very significant, isn't it, for the long term? That actually, because we can see the polling in Britain as well, there's been a dramatic shift away from Israel in favor of the Palestinians, despite the fact media coverage has been so weighted in favor of the Israeli state. So, I'm just thinking that is growing, it's escalating. That's something you can build.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the ICJ case from South Africa, the President Lula's remarks this week, Israel and the United States have isolated themselves. I mean, the United States Israel's making a buffoon of the United States' claim to fight for democracy and against authoritarianism abroad. This is Joe Biden's rules-based international order, in which he defended his support of Ukraine against the Russian invasion. Israel's making a mockery of any of those claims that of Joe Biden or the United States, and it is also in the historically, Bibi Netanyahu has done whatever he could to damage Democratic presidents in order to help Republicans, because he knows he gets even more political support, even more military support under Republican presidents. And I wouldn't put it past him to also try to drag the United States and Joe Biden into an unpopular war, because he knows that the Democratic base is against that. And so it is this unique situation where the electoral math and electoral consequences could potentially change the course of this, but it is not going to come without a major political pressure and more increasing protests and lobbying of members of Congress, call-in days, this kind of thing, to get the message across. But things have changed in the past 3 weeks in terms of these leaks, and I think it's not satisfying anyone. So now they'll have to try something new.
It's just interesting that point you made about how the US has become isolated. Before people might not know I'm a PhD dropout, but originally my plan was to become an academic, and I was studying American history, and my master's thesis was on neoconservatism rising in the 1970s as a product reflection of US decline. The reason I bring that up is it did seem like the US was in steep decline in the 1970s, but then you got the collapse of the Soviet-led world. US power got a huge boost, went into a kind of triumphalist phase, which now looks pretty hubristic, I have to say. And I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm in Greece, I'm in Athens, there's the Acropolis over there. So I'm thinking about the rise and decline of civilizations. The reason just in the 21st century, every major thing that's happened has accelerated the process of Western decline. And that you've had the financial crash, obviously, but you've had Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, all of them clearly catastrophes. And it just seems to me this is such an obvious calamity for the West generally, but the US in particular, because it's such an egregious, astonishingly deranged obscenity, which is clearly being armed and facilitated by the US. It's quite difficult to see how it recovers. And I don't know if that's even been thought of in the US in a big way.
I think it has, because if they're not scared of young people, if they're not scared of Arab or Muslim Americans in Michigan, they are somewhat afraid of their stature. This is a thing about Trumpism, that there's so many people in the foreign policy establishment in the US that hated Donald Trump because he set the US image backward and he set US relationships backwards. And this is something Joe Biden and his Jake Sullivan and other people in the White House say they care deeply about, is resetting U.S. leadership abroad, particularly as it pertains to the rise of authoritarianism and also on climate change. And so when it comes to things like this and the war and what they describe as their Cold War with China, they do not want China to increase their alliances economically or politically with countries in the global South, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. All of these are countries who have, in one way or another, supported South Africa's effort at the ICJ. And so I think that this is in so many ways, is the alliance with Bibi Netanyahu going to drag the the United States and Joe Biden through the mud on so many things that they seem to care about, whether it's their election, their status in the world, and their hawkishness on China. Everyone knows that the U.S. and Joe Biden care way more about the Russian invasion of Ukraine rather than Israel's occupation of Gaza. Is the United States going to lose support for continuing to arm Ukraine because so many countries pull out from support? They see that the U.S. picks and chooses its friends and picks and chooses its support for freedom, democracy, and human rights based on who their allies are. And so, would that make the United States look like hypocrites? Increasingly, it does seem like so. And Brazil is one of those countries that is one of those countries in the middle that could end up, right now is non-aligned, but has significant relationships with both the U.S. and China. So who knows what happens, but this is much bigger than just Israel.
Before I ask my final question, just in terms of Donald Trump, I mean, he stands in this grim tradition of what I describe as anti-Semites for Israel, in that he has a long history of saying and perpetrating anti-Semitic tropes. And Nixon was another example of this. I mean, Nixon was recorded saying all sorts of terrible anti-Semitic things, including, it should be said, to Henry Kissinger, who was, of course, Jewish. That isn't to speak about. Obviously, Henry Kissinger was a war criminal. The fact he was in an administration where he suffered anti-Semitism from a president who was foursquare behind Israel. It's quite striking. You see this with Elon Musk, other examples. But it's striking. He's been playing quite an interesting game because he seems to not be saying very much, as far as I can tell, making inflammatory statements. Is that because he's trying to just not intervene in order to let this cause division amongst the Democrats? Or is he actually saying quite a lot and it's just not being reported as much as it should be?
I think it's definitely the second one. We have this interesting media environment where the media has decided that they don't want to platform Donald Trump, and they don't want to. They don't want to platform Donald Trump, and they haven't really platformed him since January 6th. We can debate whether that was a positive or negative thing for democracy and political literacy, but a lot of Donald Trump's statements do not get amplified or covered in the mainstream media. He is mostly posting on the social media platform Truth, in which he is saying he has said horrendous things about Palestinians and Muslims in the last 3 or 4 months. He has claimed that Hamas is coming across the Mexican border. He has said he wants to increase surveillance and deportations of Palestinians and Arabs with ties to Gaza, and have a more muscular Muslim ban than what he had before. And so, this is why some of the polling is confusing, because if the media is still going to quote unquote deplatform Trump, what does that mean about whether any of these things that I just said are going to get covered or affect people's views? But yeah, I mean, I'm under no illusions that it's important to defeat Donald Trump and Trumpism, which is why I'm so concerned that Biden is putting Netanyahu ahead of that effort. And so I think Trump has said a fair amount about this, but it's just not being covered.
Just finally, what's your gut say about whether Joe Biden will be the nominee at all? Look, I know, I prefer to talk about the politics, but it is difficult to ignore the fact that the mental capacity of Joe Biden does not seem to be all that. Look, I know this becomes such a right wing, something the hard right, far right talk about a lot. And part of me makes me think just stay away from it, but it's kind of hard to ignore. I mean, what do you think? There's that and the combination of just Gaza, and there is a precedent. I mentioned LBJ before. LBJ in the end did stand down as the nominee because he was so damaged by Vietnam. Do you think that could happen?
It definitely could happen. I mean, one of the most read columnists in the U.S., Ezra Klein, called for that. Ezra Klein isn't the most left-wing columnist. He is pretty mainstream. He's center-left, mainstream Democratic Party, and he called for a convention. Look, I mean, you kind of feel like you're living in a bizarro world where when you watch TV or you read the New York Times, you have every Democratic strategist, consultant, administration official saying Joe Biden is he's so focused, he's so strong, his mind is totally there, and there's nothing to worry about. But voters are not. This is a huge divide between elite and voters, where voters are watching Joe Biden's press conferences and he does not seem all that there. And in the press conference in which he was defending his mental acuity, he got the name of, he said that the president of Mexico was controlling the Rafah border in Egypt. He said that Sisi was the president of Mexico. And so, those things wouldn't be a huge deal if it wasn't in the context of defending of a press conference entirely about whether he was too old to be president. Yeah. And so I think most voters think he's too old. I think most voters think Donald Trump is too old. Who knows how much this, it's only February and Biden's already had these major gaffes. Jon Stewart said it really well on his first show at The Daily Show. Like, does anyone have a video recording of Joe Biden seeming very strong and having his wits about him? So I don't know. I mean, right now, it does not seem like there is any effort from the most powerful figures in the Democratic Party to have a convention or have a contested convention or put forward another nominee. Ultimately, it would have to be Joe Biden himself and his team himself deciding that they would not run. And right now, it seems like they are going to defend him no matter what. And these are the same people who defended Dianne Feinstein until the very end. And so it will not happen without one of them deciding to leak something about the president that's damaging career, fully damaging.
Yeah, I think you've just underlined why after, I suppose, all the kind of the great turmoil, I kind of call it, which has existed since 2016-ish, it's increasingly felt like 2024 was the grand finale of this particular season. I don't know what's going to happen next, but it does feel like things are coming to a head somewhat with many of the multiple Ukraine, Israel, in terms of the US itself, what happens with its democracy. This is a big year. And I think we'll be speaking to you more, if that's okay with you, Waleed, because you're such an important voice and I think people can see why. Do make sure you share this video if you're watching all the podcasts. Press like, subscribe. But Waleed, honestly, thanks so much. That was so educational and disturbing, as many of my interviews tend to be at the moment. So thank you.
Thanks so much.